Welcome to this year's second Speaking of Books event, which was begun by the libraries in 2005 to showcase some of the excellent research that's being done here on campus by our faculty. And it is with great pleasure that I'm going to introduce our much in-demand speaker, Dr. Matthew Kirschenbaum. And we're very fortunate that he's taken time out of his very busy schedule to be part of our program. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about Matt, although most of you probably already know a lot about him. He's a professor in the Department of English at the University of Maryland and the director of the Graduate Certificate in Digital Studies. He's also an affiliated faculty member with the College of Information Studies at Maryland and a member of the teaching faculty at the University of Virginia's Rare Book School. His first book, Mechanisms, New Media and the Forensic Imagination, was published by the MIT Press in 2008 and won multiple prizes, including the 16th Annual Prize for a first book from the Modern Language Association. Matt speaks and writes often on topics in the digital humanities and digital culture. His work has been covered by the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Guardian, National Public Radio, the Chronicle of Higher Education, among many other outlets. With Pat Harrigan, he co-edited Zones of Control, Perspectives on Wargaming from the MIT Press, also published in 2016. He is a 2011 Guggenheim Fellow, and his most recent book, and the subject of his talk this afternoon, is Track Changes, A Literary History of Word Processing, published this year by Harvard University Press. So I want to read just a quote from the publisher's website which describes the book, in quote, "The story of writing in the digital age is every bit as messy as the ink-stained rags that littered the floor of Gutenberg's print shop, or the hot molten lead of the Linotype machine. During the period of the pivotal growth and widespread adoption of word processing as a writing technology, some authors embraced it as a marvel, while others decried it as the death of literature. The product of years of archival research and numerous interviews conducted by the author, Track Changes is the first literary history of word processing." Matt's book has already garnered much interest and many positive reviews. So I'm going to read a very short extract from John Gilby's review in the Times Higher Education. Quote, "Key to the success of Track Changes is Kirschenbaum's knack of drawing out the relationship between writers and how they adopted and adapted to the new tools. In many respects, this book is an engaging, extended love letter to the word processor. But it is much more than that. It is an impressively researched record of a radical, perhaps uniquely creative chapter in the often turbulent relationship between technology and the written word." I also want to briefly mention that as you walk into McKeldin on the right in the lobby, you will see an exhibit that Matt put up. It includes some materials that he collected while researching for his book. It's up until tomorrow at 11 a.m. So if you want to take a look at it, you want to do so after you leave today or early in the morning. After his talk, there will be ample time for questions. Copies of the book are available at the back of the room for $30. Great price. And Matt will be happy to sign them for you after his presentation. So I now would like to turn this over to Matt and thank him very much for being one of our speakers.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for coming out for this. Can folks hear me okay in the back? Am I good? Great. Big thank you to Pat and Eric and Karen and everybody else who helped put this together. It's kind of a warmish, dimmish room with a lot of sugar on the sideboard, so I have my work cut out for me. I'm going to talk for maybe 40, 45 minutes. I have a lot of slides to show. I like to show things. That's also the impulse that led to the exhibition downstairs. So other than a very, very brief section, I'm not going to be reading from the book. I'm going to be showing you things and talking about them. And I promise not to check 538 for the next hour if you want. So I'm going to start here. This is Time magazine from January 1, 1983. And the personal computer is its machine of the year. This is the only time in its history that Time magazine has given its annual honorific to an artifact, to a built thing, a technology. And in many ways, the early 1980s are the center of gravity for my book. If you look at just the technological history from that era, it's remarkable. You have the earliest personal computers, things like the Commodore PET and the Apple II. Those are on the market 1977. WordStar, which is the first really consumer word processor, that's 1979. The IBM PC is 1981. Other machines that you may not have heard of if you haven't lived through them, like the K-Pro and the Osborne. Those were also 81, 82. So personal computers were becoming affordable. Computers were no longer big, monstrous, room-sized machines that only the elite had access to. And I'm particularly interested in the subtitle that Time magazine uses here, "The Computer Moves In." And it speaks to me of the way in which, right around this time, computers are becoming domesticated. They're moving in. They're inside of people's, not just their offices, but their homes. And so this is not me, but it could have been. That's actually the computer that I grew up with. It's an Apple IIe. And it's the kind of computer room that I was lucky enough, privileged enough to enjoy as a kid growing up. And here too, we see the computer moving in. It has its own dedicated space. It's sort of fully integrated into the messy space of the home. And this was very much true for a kid like this or a kid like me, but it was also true for writers, including some pretty famous ones. And so here, of course, is Stephen King. This photo is taken a little bit later. It's actually taken in the mid-1990s. And what interests me about this image, besides the general messiness and clutter and sort of complete lack of pretense, here in Stephen King's office, it's small, it's kind of cramped. His dog is under the table, but of course there's the computer in the background, and I'll say more about that in just a moment. But he's leaning back in his chair, he's working with a pen or a pencil, he's writing longhand, and it reminds us that the technologies that we use to write they're never monolithic. They coexist with one another in this sort of what I keep coming back to as thinking of as a kind of messy space. So the computer is there, the pen and paper is there. Oftentimes these things are coexisting. They're not in competition with one another. This is Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick. She's writing the book that became known as entitled Between Men. This was 1982 or 1983. She's using, I know you can't see it too well in the lighting here, but she's using a computer called an Osborne 1. You can see she has the keyboard on her lap. She's reclining. She has a blanket over her. So computers were also changing our postures, our ergonomic relation to them. Very much themes that Sedgwick herself was writing about, our embodied relationship to the technology. I also like this image, which is in the book, because there's a cat. So it's a book about technology, and there is the obligatory cat. Here we see Ralph Ellison. He has, you might be able to make it out, it's the same Osborne 1 computer. He's actually using it with a larger monitor. Ralph Ellison, of course, is best known for Invisible Man, which he published in the early 1950s. But he spent the rest of his literary career working on a second novel, which he never finished. It was published in 2 different editions, both incomplete posthumously. He got the computer in 1982, and some of his critics believe that that's the reason he never finished writing it, because he spent so much time just revising his sentences, going over and over the same pages again and again. Most critics actually don't subscribe to that view, but what I wanted to really try to tease out in the book was what it meant for machines like this. This is a weird object. I mean, look, if you we can recognize it as a computer, maybe even as something like a portable computer, but it's a weird thing to suddenly have appear in a writer's workspace. The screen, that tiny little screen, but it glowed with those luminescent letters. It was noisy. The disk would churn and click and clack. The keyboard was noisy. It threw off heat, and there was also a fan that ran to cool it down. It even had odors associated with it, and so it was very much a kind of palpable presence in the writer's workspace, the computer was. And I wanted to really try to recapture what that meant. And that that thinking informed a lot of the stories that I tell in the book, which are very much about writers and the sort of peculiar relationships that they created with these new technologies. So, of course, one question that people always have is, and this is, I think, commonplace when we're talking about new technologies of most any kind, is who was first? And we can address that question through literary history when we're speaking about the typewriter. Mark Twain, if you can make it out there where I've circled, Mark Twain has staked the claim that, as he puts it, he was the first person in the world to apply the type machine, that's what he called it, the type machine to literature. And we know that he did have a typewriter, a Remington No. 2. This would have been in the 1870s. We know that he also employed a secretary whom he would dictate to. The novel that he mentions in connection with the typewriter here is Tom Sawyer. Twain scholars actually believe that to be a mistake. They believe the novel that he's referring to having typewritten is actually Life on the Mississippi, which you may know is actually nonfiction. It's a memoir. But this is not a bad candidate for the first person to use a typewriter in the course of producing what we would recognize as a literary work. So the question becomes, can we pose a similar question for computers and word processing? And of course, the answer is, well, it depends. Different candidates come forth depending on what your sort of qualifiers are. And so here we have the person whose back is mostly towards us is named Jerry Pournelle. He's a science fiction writer. He is working here. You can see he's got 2 screens. This photo was taken in the late 1970s. Pournelle was a prolific writer. He got his computer probably in 1977 or 1978. Besides his science fiction, he also quickly established himself in computer journalism, and he began publishing articles about writers and their use of computers, why writers should use computers. He was a very practical person. He had no sort of romantic attachment or sentimental attachment to a typewriter or writing longhand with a quill pen or a goose feather or anything else. He was concerned only with how fast he could write and how easily he could revise. And so he put out several books a year. He began publishing magazine articles. This is him in 1984, and you can see that there's this kind of science fiction style artwork here of him on the cover, standing atop this sort of heap of conquered computer hardware. So this becomes Jerry Cornell's User's Guide to Small Computers. And so he establishes himself as very much a visible figure who is proselytizing for writers and computers. But there are other figures who come forward too. This is a writer named Gay Porter. She publishes a book called The Midwife in 1981, but she began using the word processor that you see here back in 1977. It's an IBM word processor. And she and her husband actually bought that machine together for their family business. She had aspirations to write a novel. She didn't think she could do it because of a combination of childcare responsibilities and her obligations to the business. She thought writing and revising it and researching it and everything else would take too long. But she realized that she found herself able to snatch a half hour here, an hour there in the course of the day at the word processor, and a few years later she had her novel. So you can think of, if you're thinking of, for example, Virginia Woolf's Room of Her Own, you might think of this as Gay Porter acquiring a screen of her own, and to me it becomes a really sort of powerful example of how the technology is actually enabling literary production within a wider set of social circumstances. So what we're looking at here, so now we're moving back a few years further, still in our quest to figure out who was first. So Jerry Cornell, Gay Porter, it's hard to know which of them came first. Cornell certainly published first. Gay Porter may have started using her word processor before him though. But if you go back a few years earlier, John Hersey, who is best known for a nonfiction work called Hiroshima. He's a journalist and he's in residence at Yale University. In 1973, and you can actually, I'm not sure if you can make it out, but you can actually see the date and timestamp up there. In 1973, he uses a mainframe computer at Yale University to revise and typeset a novel that he calls My Petition for More Space. It's a work of, it's science fiction, it's speculative fiction. He doesn't actually compose the novel. He has a first draft longhand, but then he retypes it and revises it. So this is what I mean by it's messy, it's complicated when we try to decide who was first. It really does depend on what criteria. But if we go back even a couple of years before that, we find ourselves not at Yale University, but in a townhouse in London. And this is the writer Len Deighton, who had established himself in the 1960s writing spy thrillers. He was very commercially successful, and he was able to purchase this machine that you see there in the foreground. It's called a magnetic tape selectric typewriter. It's the first device that IBM actually marketed under the label of a word processor. It has no screen. The way that it worked was that you would type things in at the selectric typewriter keyboard there, and every keystroke was also being stored magnetically on tape there. So then you could go back and revise things and print them out. Again, IBM called that a word processor. They used the term because it sold for $10,000 in 1960s money. You couldn't sell somebody a magnetic tape selectric typewriter for $10,000, but you could sell them a word processor for $10,000 because it sounded a lot better. So Deighton bought this machine, but he didn't actually use it. This is an outtake from the same photo shoot. And you can see his assistant now in the foreground in front of the selectric keyboard. Her name is Eleanor Handley. She's the person who actually learned how to use the MTST. She's the person who actually processed the manuscript of the novel that Deighton was writing. The novel is called Bomber. It's fiction about World War II. But again, we see how tricky it is to answer that who was first question, because in this case, the writer himself is not using the word processor, but nonetheless, the technology is very much involved in the production of the manuscript through the collaboration of his assistant, Eleanor Handley, and that gendered relationship we'll be coming back to in just a moment. So what I do in the book is present really a spectrum of different candidates, people who I think, like these, have different reasons for staking that claim of being first. So we have different contenders. But really, as I began sort of getting deeper into this history, the who was first question, I found that sort of becoming less and less compelling. There were other really interesting things to talk about. And what I realized was that this was very much becoming a book about the actual work, the actual labor of writing. Right? Writing is hard work. And we all know it's hard work. Certainly, it's hard work sort of emotionally and creatively. We all know what it means to have writer's block and to sort of wrestle with getting a sentence just right. But it's hard work physically. I mean, in part, we know this through things like carpal tunnel syndrome and the kinds of actual bodily injuries we associate with writing too much. But, just in more mundane terms, you've all had, a stiff neck, a cramped back, and so forth from too much writing. And so writing is real work. And the question is, whose work is it? And historically, writing has often been women's work. Here we see in this photograph, here's Tolstoy, and he's posing here with, as the caption has it, his 3 assistants. You may know that the word typewriter was, in addition to the actual device, the word typewriter was also applied to the people who worked the device. So from the late 19th century on through much of the 20th century, you can think of a TV show like Mad Men, women were typewriters in the sense that they were the operators of the machine. And you have a kind of skewed portrait of creativity here in which the male author figure stands above his 3 assistants, all of whom form a kind of system for producing the material embodiment of his imagination, his creativity, and so forth. That's very much a kind of gendered pattern, gendered figure that replays itself over and over again in this history. And by the time we get to the 1960s and 70s, this is another MTST. This one is in a commercial setting. We have, again, a woman who is operating it at the keyboard. And just as her predecessors were known as typewriters, she herself was known as a word processor. And so word processing, before it was a piece of software, before it was a piece of hardware, it was a vocation. You could perhaps aspire to be a word processor, or probably more likely hope you didn't turn out to be one, because it was not easy work. Word processing was also an organizational term. It had there was a lot of interest in it from the 1970s forward. This is just a kind of representative diagram that shows a kind of idealized layout for a rationalized office space with different pods, as they were known, for the word processor operators. Again, it's interesting to think about what kind of space this actually was. On the one hand, people are seated facing away from each other, looking at screens. On the other hand, it's a at least partially open space, and so there is movement, circulation that's possible through it. Different kinds of relationships, intra-office relationships, would be facilitated by a space like this. So word processing was also very much a kind of organizational and managerial concept in the 1970s. It was sometimes presented as overtly emancipatory. So this advertisement actually ran in the debut issue of Gloria Steinem's Miss magazine in 1971. And it's entitled in that kind of, bell-bottom font, the death of the dead end secretary. And basically the message here was that word processing, the technology, would sort of allow women to sort of break out of the drudgery and routine of doing all of that typing work. They would no longer be secretaries stuck in dead-end jobs. They could move into positions of higher authority. That was part of the marketing rhetoric behind the technology. The reality was different. This is from a zine called Process World that was circulating in the early 1980s. And I think the image alone conveys the message, but in case you missed it, the caption, "Are you doing the processing or are you being processed?" That was very much sort of a kind of product of early 80s office culture. This is one of the more interesting finds that I came across in my research. It's actually a hand-printed artist's book in a small edition of about 100 copies. So it's letterpress printed, but it's entitled "A Poem Written at Work on a Wang Word Processor Sometime in the Afternoon Wanting to Leave." And it's by a poet named Patricia Fried Ackerman, and she would have been employed in exactly the kind of sort of typing pool or word processing pod that I was just describing. So the book certainly sort of took me in some ways unexpectedly. It took me into that kind of office history, labor history, certainly these questions about gender and the work and labor of writing. Those are a central sort of component of the book. But I also was very much figuring out how to perform this research as I was going about it. And so I started back at this photograph, which is really one of the true origin points for the project. I had seen this photo of Stephen King many times. I'm a fan of his writing, and so I had seen the photo many times. And I actually knew that Stephen King used a Wang word processor. That was part of sort of the some lore that would circulate around him. He sort of famously had a Wang word processor, and he made all of the jokes that you might expect Stephen King to make about that. But there it is in the picture. But I was wondering, well, what type was it exactly? I mean, did anybody know, and did it matter? I mean, could we actually recover sort of any technical knowledge of that system? And so I did some digging, I did some research, I learned a lot more about Wang word processors. They were the preeminent, they were sort of the best of breed brand in the 1970s for word processing. It turns out, not that this is, I think, what's finally interesting or relevant, but he's using what's known as a System 5 Model 3 Wang. It was Wang's standalone product, so in lots of ways they're equivalent of a personal computer, my word from Wang. Stephen King wrote a short story called The Word Processor of the Gods in 1983. It's published here in his 1985 Skeleton Crew collection. You can actually see it downstairs in the exhibition case. It was originally published in Playboy magazine in 1983, and Stephen King tells us in his introduction that he had always aspired to publish something in Playboy. So there you have it, but it's probably the first piece of fiction that I know of that actually features a word processor as a main actor in the plot. In other words, he's to my knowledge, the first writer who's sort of writing about word processing as a specific technology that would be recognizable to his readers as opposed to in some sort of more speculative or fantastical mode. And it being a Stephen King story, it doesn't exactly, things happen. I won't spoil it for you. But anyway, I began to do some work around Stephen King and his Wang word processor, digging to see what I could find out and trying to figure out what I wanted to do with this story. And I gave a talk at the New York Public Library that I called Stephen King's Wang. This was back in 2012, and then this happened. And so this is the New York Times. They had a reporter in the audience, and they did this sort of big write-up about an English professor who was interested in word processors. And as when I show this to people, I like to point out it was a slow news day. It was published on December 25th, on Christmas Day. But the reason I show this is that this was really a kind of lesson to me in what I think what the project, I really sort of grasped what the project would become, because the day after this was published, I checked my email and my inbox had hundreds of messages in it. Many people have seen this story. People reached out to me. A handful of them were fairly famous people who I never would have had any kind of access to otherwise, but lots of people who either had been part of the early computer industry or just had interesting stories to pass along to me, tips, contacts, things I should look at. And that very much became a kind of characteristic pattern throughout the roughly 5-year period when I was researching the book. And I did whatever, I realized how important it was to the work. I was learning things I was never going to learn otherwise. I was in contact with people I never would have otherwise been in contact with. And so I wasn't shy about talking about what I was doing. I gave a lot of talks about the book when it was still in progress. I used my Twitter account to talk about what I was doing. And it very much evolved into a kind of reciprocal relationship where the more that I sort of put out there into the world, the more that came back to me. And as a scholar, as a researcher, as a historian, that was a really important lesson to learn. The power of, in fact, sharing what you're doing and not keeping it under wraps until the book is ready. But I did other things besides tweet. I spent a lot of time looking at, for example, magazines from that period, and I quickly noticed that writers were often used to sell computers and word processors. So there we see Isaac Asimov, who is shilling for Radio Shack there on the left. And this is Robert Ludlum, who is promoting Atari here on the right. And I think images like this are interesting in all kinds of ways. Obviously, the relationship between the writer and the company who's promoting the technology. But also, I think there are other ways to read them too, in terms of just the sort of kind of the visual storytelling that's going on here, the way in which the different scenes are photographed, the way in which they're lit, the kind of statement that they seem to be making about what the technology is. So artifacts like this, I think, are sort of endlessly generative. Just another example of the kind of question I thought it was important to try to answer. This is a caricature by David Levine, who you may recognize his work in he used to work for the New York Review of Books, and he drew many author caricatures for the New York Review of Books throughout his career. He always posed writers, or almost always posed them, with either a pen or a typewriter. And so I wondered, when did he begin posing writers with computers for the first time? And as best I could tell, the answer is 1984. This is Alison Lurie, who wrote a novel called Foreign Affairs. And this is the first David Levine sketch that I could find where the writer is posed with a computer as opposed to a typewriter or a pen. And again, to me, that becomes significant just as a kind of marker, as a way of indexing the culture where we were in 1984 in terms of the extent to which computers were becoming accepted as integral parts of the literary imagination. By 1984, 1985, 1986, it wouldn't have seemed strange to picture a writer with a computer as opposed to a typewriter. Another example from in the same vein, this is in the book. This is an crumb drawing of Charles Bukowski with his Macintosh, and the caption there, "Old writer puts on sweater, sits down, leers into computer screen, and writes about life. How holy can we get?" So this is drawn in 1994, and again, the way in which the computer is becoming fully assimilated into the larger stock of cultural imagery around the act of writing. I looked at movies and TV shows, and these are really fun to talk about, but I'm not going to linger over them. But films like Stand By Me and Doogie Howser and Sex and the City all sort of feature computers, often as part of the intro and outro segments. This was the kind of gag that was people just found this endlessly funny back in the 80s, before we had the internet and cat memes. You had things like this, and so the joke was that the pencil, or sometimes it was a fountain pen, was presented as a kind of fully featured word processor. This is, so another kind of research that I did, besides looking at sort of popular ephemera like the last few examples, I also did more traditional kinds of archival research. And so this is from John Updike's papers, which are at the Houghton. You can actually see a reproduction of this downstairs in the exhibit where you can read the text. It's a poem entitled Invalid Keystroke. Like Stephen King, Updike's first computer was a Wang word processor. He actually got it at about the same time as Stephen King. And like Stephen King, who wrote the short story on his, Updike sat down and composed this poem entitled Invalid Keystroke. I'll just read you the very beginning. "We word processor, is it not de trop of you to put a dot between the words your nimble screen displays in phosphorescent green?" He sent it to the New Yorker and it was rejected. Part of the archival research meant also looking at things like this. So these are floppy diskettes that belong to Updike. And I worked with what we call born digital material, as well as typescripts like this one. This is actually a typewriter ribbon, again, Updike. This is the ribbon that came out of his typewriter just before it was auctioned at Christie's. And the last thing that we can read on the ribbon, he's informing his secretary that he won't be needing her services anymore because he's just purchased a word processor. So archival research, this is archival research of a slightly different kind. Here I am at the Microsoft Archives in Bellevue, Washington. And yes, the Microsoft, they do have corporate archives. They have a dedicated facility. It's actually well-staffed, quite well-organized. They take it very seriously. I show this because I'm actually doing an oral history interview here with Charles Simoni, who is regarded as the sort of patriarch figure behind both Microsoft Word and Microsoft Excel. And so talking to people was yet another thing I had to learn how to do. I mean, I knew how to talk to people, but talking to people in order to draw out their own personal histories in ways that were sort of rich and expressive and without me as the interviewer getting in the way, that's not something I had learned how to do in graduate school or even as an assistant professor. So one day you find yourself in the archives at Microsoft talking to a Microsoft billionaire and you do the best you can. That's another friend I met at Microsoft. This was really interesting to me. So this is from a computer manual of the time. So again, more of just the kind of material that I looked at. You can see the illustration here. One of the common anxieties was that people who, using a computer for the first time, the fear was that when the text scrolled off the edge of the screen, that it would sort of be gone for good. And so this is from a piece of software called PerfectWriter. You can see the sort of rolling paper back here that sort of was a kind of visual metaphor. So that, again, sort of exposed a very real anxiety that users at the time had, which seems sort of funny and quaint to us now, but which was not at the time. One last sort of methodology was what I call reenactment. Some of you know that I actually collect old machines like this, and of course I didn't, this is a K-Pro 2 computer that came out in 1982. I didn't use this to write the book, it's running WordStar here, but I did learn how to use WordStar so that I would have, and this gets us back in some ways to the sorts of things I was talking about at the outset, I got a real hands-on feel for what it meant to sit in front of this particular computer, use this software, which is WordStar is very powerful software, but you can see you have to rely on the keyboard commands, which are all laid out on this stencil here, and working with it is certainly very, very different from something like Microsoft Word, but I felt it was important to kind of be able to experience what writers who would have been using it at the time would have experienced for themselves. So, two more brief sections, and then we're done. But one of the questions, one of the things that always comes up when I talk about the book, people always ask me about Frederick Nietzsche. And the reason they do is that Nietzsche has a famous quotation, a famous aphorism, in which he says that our writing instruments are shaping our thoughts. And it makes a lot of sense, right? I mean, if somebody puts a crayon in your hand, you're going to not just write differently, you're going to write probably different things than you would if somebody put a fountain pen in your hand or if you sat down in front of your word processor. This device, which kind of looks like a pushball, is a typewriter. It's called the Malling-Hansen writing ball. And you actually worked it by placing the palm of your hand over the keyboard there. Nietzsche was going blind when he acquired this machine, and he was able to work it by touch, so it allowed him to continue to write. And that aphorism of his, our writing instruments are shaping our thoughts, came from his realization that he was sort of producing these sort of brief, terse sentences. A machine like this didn't really lend itself to long, expressive, expansive prose. His style became very telegraphic. So people always ask the question of how computers changed authors' writing styles. Do we write differently now that we have computers than we did 30 or 40 years ago? And I actually don't think we do, or at least I don't think that we can easily generalize about that change. Some people, if you ask them, will tell you that because we live in this soundbite culture where everything is reduced to tweets and text messages, that our writing is becoming very much like Nietzsche's, and it's becoming very terse and aphoristic. Other people will tell you that computers make it so easy to write that you can just go on, and you can, your sentences get out of control, and you can just pile up the adjectives one after another. And I think both of those things to a certain degree are true. I think computers are now familiar enough to us that we have taken to sort of using them in our own idiosyncratic ways. But I do think, nonetheless, there are some real changes that the technology made. And the way that I sum those up in the book is with the word perfect. Perfect is a word that you encounter over and over again in the word processing literature from the time. Certainly word perfect, which many of you will remember, but there were other word processing programs that also had the word perfect in the title. And writers were really taken with the notion, and none of them believed it. Everybody understood on some level that it was a fiction. But nonetheless, some writers really seemed to think that with a word processor you could write something approaching a perfect novel. And it wasn't just that you could revise easily and even endlessly. It was also the way in which the word processor put the entire text at your fingertips. The entire text, the entire manuscript, was sort of available to you in a way that it's not when it's a pile of typewritten pages that are kind of all jumbled together in a big stack, and you have to go sort of picking through them to find where was it that you used that word that you don't want to use again and repeat, or what was that character's name, or some sentence that you now need to rework, what page was that on? All of that changed when writers began using word processors and the textual field became available to them in its entirety almost instantly. And they could search, they could do find and replace, and they found that the text was malleable in ways that it just hadn't been before. And that's where this sort of notion of perfection, I think, really came from. I was going to read a short passage from the book where Anne Rice is talking about this. I think I will, and then we can wrap it up. But just to give you a sense of the sort of language that writers themselves used when talking about their word processors. So I'm just going to read a very little bit from the book. Anne Rice got her first computer on Osborne 1, which we've already seen, from Macy's on credit. She used WordStar and quickly realized it was doing something profound to her. Quote, "Well, I think once you really get used to a computer and you get used to entering the information from the keyboard, things happen in your mind. I mean, you change as a writer," she claimed in a 1985 CBS radio interview after writing The Vampire Lestat. And here she is again. "You're able to do things that maybe you never would have thought of doing before. I think your mind has to meet that challenge. I think it takes about 2 years to realize what this thing can really do so that you begin to use its whole potential, because what it does is it forces you to come up to it." So such interesting language there. It forces you to come up to it. It says, "I can do anything you want now. So think, what do you want me to do?" That's all Anne Rice. In another interview a few years later, Rice would go even further, calling her subsequent novel, Queen of the Damned, the first book in which I really used the computer as the pure poetic tool it is capable of being. She describes being able to move effortlessly across the full expanse of the text, backward and forward with near simultaneity, editing and revising at will. She contrasts the experience to the typewriter and the accumulation of large and ponderous drafts, the necessity of having to retype whole chapters after introducing even minor changes. Quote, "You're dealing with a mechanism, with labor, and all of that swept away by the computer. You're no longer making the mechanical compromises that move the writing away from poetry." And notice again her language there. She's really again talking about work. She's talking about the labor, the work of writing. And thus, the inevitable conclusion, this is me, the inevitable conclusion as ominous in its own way as a dynasty of immortal vampires. Quote Anne Rice, "There's really no excuse for not writing the perfect book." So, and there she is in a more recent photograph. I have one more section, but I think I'm going to stop it there and take questions. If somebody wants to ask me about the way that we're using word processors now, that's a question I'm equipped to answer. I even have some slides, but I did want to show this too. One of the best parts about finishing and publishing a book is you get cake. So thank you very much, and happy to take questions.
We would like to use this microphone for the questions because we're recording this. There's some more food over here, so I'm inviting you all to come up and finish that off. We don't want anything left over. So who has a question?
I have a loud voice. I can probably
Okay.
Okay. Oh, okay. Thank you so much. That was an awesome presentation, and your research is just so exciting to hear about. So you talk a lot about how people are using the technologies and how writers are using the technology,
Yeah.
but who is creating this technology? And are there like writers who are involved in the making of this technology?
Yeah, there are. So that's a really interesting question. I did learn when I went to Microsoft that Michael Crichton actually consulted with them for a little while on Microsoft Word. But I think the more interesting sort of answer is that for the big, the big companies like Microsoft or WordPerfect before it, those technologies, they were never aimed at creative writers. These were business applications. And the most famous example of that is the first word processor released for the Macintosh, MacWrite, which came out in 1984. It shipped with the original Macintosh. It would only save files that were shorter than about 8 pages. That was the maximum file length. And so it was fine for like business letters and office memos, but if you were a fiction writer, you better make sure that your chapters were all 8 pages or less, or you couldn't use MacWrite. Nowadays, there are, besides the big players like Microsoft, or for that matter, Google or Apple, you do have what I think of as boutique software, which is sort of small, specialized software that's usually written or programmed by just a couple of individuals. And the best example of that is a software called Scrivener, which was actually developed by a novelist. He didn't like sort of using Word, he felt constrained by it, and so he wanted to develop a kind of creative writer's word processor, and it's called Scrivener, and it's actually fairly popular. It has a kind of real user base behind it. So yeah, you're very much sort of seeing that in niche markets.
Thanks so much. Could you talk a little bit also of, I'm thinking about how word processors might get integrated upstream in the production of a novel, in publishing houses, correspondences with editors, the actual like track changes part of track changes as well?
Sure, I mean, that gets into really interesting stuff too. So on the one hand, you can think about sort of the really long-term picture, posterity, what are the equivalents of literary manuscripts in a digital age? What happens if a writer is using the actual track changes feature while she's writing her book, right? And what will we, as scholars, we're used to looking at manuscripts and seeing where things have been crossed out and things have changed. What does that mean when you're dealing with electronic documents as opposed to physical manuscripts? That's something else that I've done work on, and it's a really sort of active area of interest for me, for some other scholars, for archivists who are thinking about this. But there's also the publishing side of the question, and what I'm sort of fond of saying is that nowadays books as objects are first and foremost digital objects. They are only in a kind of secondary and derivative way do they become physical things that we hold in our hands. And what I mean by that is that even if the writer himself or herself is not using a word processor, at some point the text is keyboarded and it becomes a digital text. It's certainly copy edited that way, probably using the track changes feature as the author goes back and forth with their editor, and there's copy editing. And then it's typeset, it's laid out. Nowadays the software of choice is Adobe InDesign, and that's how the book is actually set. And so it evolves through the publishing process. It takes on different layers, different formats as a digital object, a digital entity. And then when the book is published, it's published certainly like this, but it's also published as an ebook. And sometimes it's published as a sound file, as an audio book. So there are different manifestations of the end product, only one of which is this, this wonderful object that we hold in our hands. And so books, to me, nowadays, unless you're talking about a fine press production that is actually hand set, books to me are digital objects before they are printed objects.
I've heard about writers who were born in the 1930s, like Harlan Ellison or Frederick Forsyth or Larry McMurtry,
Yeah.
who never used a word processor.
Yeah.
Did you find any examples of any baby boomers or even people younger who tried to stay away from computers?
I do, and I mean, this is a kind of like, I don't know if I would say it's a favorite subject for the internet, but it's not hard to find listicles and BuzzFeed articles and that sort of thing, famous writers who don't use a word processor. And this is often presented as a kind of point of virtue, right? It somehow becomes this marker of like creativity and artistry and authenticity that they don't touch a computer. So famous examples, Neil Gaiman, for example, is known to favor, he's known to write longhand using a fountain pen. Stephen King, actually, in the course of his career, has gone back and forth. He's written with a fountain pen too, or certainly so he claims. J.K. Rowling famously wrote the first Harry Potter novel longhand, and then because she couldn't afford a computer at the time. What's interesting to me about these stories is not, the sort of sweepstakes for who, it's not sort of the purist mentality or the sweepstakes for who can be the most unsullied by the touch of a digital keyboard, but rather, the reality that we all sort of have this kind of full spectrum approach to writing. I mean, I use a computer all the time, but I still walk around with a pen in my pocket too, and I write on sticky notes, and I write on the backs of envelopes. And for a working writer, lots of writers still work longhand. They still sort of incorporate that as part of their process. At some point, though, in the ways I was just describing, whether it's the writer's own fingers that's performing the work or somebody else's hands that are paid to do that work, at some point the text is going to be keyboarded. And it turns out that a lot of those writers who have garnered these sort of reputations as typewriter purists, in fact, at some point in their process, they too sit down in front of the word processor, at least to look at the text, revise it, and so forth. So I think lists like that and anecdotes like that are sort of most interesting to me for the ways that they sort of index a certain kind of attitude that revolves around some notion of like the technology somehow compromising true creative vision.